It was supposed to be a luxury vacation. Over 2,500 people on a once-in-a-lifetime trip across the beautiful Caribbean Sea on the world's largest cruise liner. It would be a trip they'll never forget for sure, but one they wish they could. On the bridge, Captain Tory Myra and his crew are about to make a series of decisions that will trigger one of the most dramatic cruise ship accidents in maritime history, where an inexperienced officer, a misplaced navigation buoy, and a momentary distraction will turn a peaceful night into a desperate fight for survival. As midnight approached on December 15, 1998, the Monarch of the Seas was sailing across the Caribbean from the small Caribbean island of St. Thomas to Martinique, a journey of around 370 miles. Not much earlier, a passenger had become too sick for the onboard medical team to handle. So, having only traveled a third of the way, they decided to take a detour to Great Bay, in the island of St. Martin. They reached there about half past midnight. Captain Myra, a Norwegian with years of maritime experience, was in command of the vessel. At 40 minutes past midnight, he made a record in the log that the ship was drifting on an easterly heading in position 0.4 nautical miles south of Fort Amsterdam. It was a slow enough drift that it was nothing he should worry about. While the vessel drifted, the ship's doctor and nurse accompanied the ill passenger to shore, using a launch boat called the Santa Maria, which came alongside at 10 minutes after the captain made his note. For nearly an hour, the massive ship maintained its position, engines idling as it awaited the return of its medical staff. At 25 minutes past 1 in the morning, the doctor and nurse returned to the vessel. The ship's log recorded tender alongside with doctor and nurse, and then tender off shipside. Captain Myra took control of the navigation himself, turning the ship to starboard from its easterly heading. Then he steadied the vessel, intending to pass east of the Proselyte Reef. It's both a popular dive site and a navigation hazard. Present on the bridge were Captain Myra, Staff Captain Hans Andresen, Second Officer Mons Fjellinger, who was the officer of the watch, an experienced off-duty helmsman named Per Rold, and the duty helmsman Frank Arthur Kruger, who served as the lookout. Hans Andresen later admitted to investigators that he was surprised by the decision to sail to the east side of the reef, but he felt like he couldn't suggest going the safer western route because his suggestions in the past had been met with a negative response by Captain Myra. It was a tense bridge, and the captain didn't like his decision questioned, which is why what happened next was all the more odd. Just 3 minutes after getting underway, Captain Myra handed over the navigational watch to Fjellinger. Before leaving the bridge, he asked, "How are we doing with clearance to buoy?" Fjellinger replied confidently, closest point would be 3 cables off and safe. Fjellinger was the least experienced man on the bridge, at least in his position. He'd only been working as a second officer for 27 weeks, though he had more experience as a sailor, starting out as a radio operator in 1988. But he'd never been in charge of navigation while sailing across the Caribbean Sea at night. That would become a problem. What neither he nor the captain knew was that the chart they were using hadn't been updated with the latest information. The buoy marking the Proselyte Reef had been moved approximately 400 feet west of the position shown on their outdated chart. The captain and first officer's course selection was based largely on what they could see. Fjellinger had used the ship's automatic radar plotting aid, or ARPA, but the system can only do what it's told to do. If your charts are off, ARPA will be off. By then, the Proselyte Reef lighted buoy was about 60 to 70 degrees on the starboard bow. But Captain Myra was confident that his second officer knew what he was doing and left the bridge. The ship's log recorded change of command. The ship was now traveling at 5 to 6 knots, with Staff Captain Andresen monitoring the propulsion machinery and gradually increasing the ship's speed. When Fjelllinger checked the ship's position, he made several critical errors. He failed to input set drift calculations into the ARPA to account for the easterly wind and westerly current that were moving the ship toward the reef. He didn't ground lock the ARPA, which means configuring the radar to use the ground rather than the sea or movements in the water. If he had, it would have provided more accurate positioning. And most importantly, he relied solely on the buoy's position, which wasn't where he thought it was. Fjelllinger planned to change course for the remaining journey to Martinique, once the ship was at a right angle to the buoy. As the ship continued forward, the bridge was relatively quiet. Fjelllinger monitored the vessel's progress on the ARPA, watching as they approached the point where he would need to order the course change. But just before reaching this critical moment, Fjelllinger received a telephone call about a passenger who was complaining about a noise near his cabin. Fjelllinger promised to send someone to look into it. At about the same moment, an automatic smoke detector alarm sounded on the bridge. The lookout, Frank Arthur Kruger, responded to this alarm, found all was well, and then silenced it. These two minor distractions, a phone call and a false alarm, diverted Fjellinger's attention at the most critical moment. Almost immediately after he hung up the phone, he spotted the lighted buoy close to the ship to starboard, first through the window, then on the radar. It was time to turn around the reef. He ordered helmsman Per Rold to change course. No visual bearings were taken. No other navigational instruments were used. The only instrument used to determine the ship's position in relation to the buoy was the ARPA, and it, like its operators, was mistaken. At about 1:30 a.m., as the ship started to turn left, the Monarch of the Seas raked the Proselyte Reef while traveling at roughly 12 knots. But luckily, the liner didn't become permanently stranded. After feeling the impact shake the ship, Captain Myra rushed back to the bridge and took over the command of the ship. The ship's log recorded Captain Tor Myra on the bridge. Water was pouring into several tanks and watertight compartments, and the vessel had dropped in the water. The ship's chief engineer junior and the safety officer reported that there was too much water in pump rooms 1 and 2 for them to handle, so they were closing watertight doors 1 and 2 and concentrating on leaks in pump rooms 3 and 4. 3 of the ship's watertight compartments were completely flooded, with several others partially flooded. The coral reef had torn a massive gash along the starboard hull, 130 by 6 feet in size. 2 diesel fuel tanks and 1 overflow tank had also been breached, causing a small fuel spill of approximately 100 US gallons. The crew moved fast. Just 5 minutes after the impact, all the ship's watertight doors were closed from the bridge, with the exception of watertight door number 10, which was discovered later in an open position by the ship's safety officer, who then closed it manually. At 1:36 a.m., Captain Myra announced Bravo, Bravo, Bravo on the PA system, the ship's code for an emergency. The captain consulted with his senior crew. They weren't sinking, at least not quickly, and they hadn't been stranded on the reef. There was no point in disembarking the passengers right away. It was decided that it would be safer to go back to St. Martin and intentionally ground the ship on a sandbank in Great Bay. But first, they had to get the passengers off the ship, all 2,557 of them. At 1:47, the general emergency signal was given, and all passengers and crew were told to report to their respective emergency and abandoned ship stations. Frequent updates were provided over the public address system in English, Spanish, French, and German languages. The lifeboats were readied for embarkation from the promenade deck by 2:10 and 2:15 respectively. All passenger and crew cabins were reported to be evacuated by 2:20. Thankfully, despite the vast number of people on board, it was a well-trained and well-rehearsed procedure. Just 15 minutes later, guests and crew were told to brace themselves. At 2:35, Captain Myra intentionally grounded the ship on a sandbar in Great Bay, St. Martin, without further damage. The ship's log recorded, ship grounded in Great Bay, St. Martin. Less than 10 minutes later, a pilot from the local Coast Guard came on board the Monarch to assist. The captain had decided that passengers should be taken off the ship, and he contacted them via the tannoy to let them know. Around this time, reports of injuries came through. A nurse asked for a stretcher team to assist, and there were reports of other small injuries, and a few cases of hyperventilation and panicking passengers who needed mild sedation, but nothing serious. They'd been lucky. At 2:45, the first tender came to disembark guests on port side at bunker and crew gates. But the water kept on pouring in. At 3:26 hours, Staff Captain Andreasen reported that there was 3 to 5 feet of water already above the lowest deck, and water was filling the elevator shaft. They didn't know if the Monarch would tip one way or the other, or if the flooding would reach the decks where the lifeboats were being prepared. Getting those boats filled and launched before things became worse would be difficult. They were in a race against time. Local tender boats made all the difference. Racing to the Monarch from St. Martin, ships like the Santa Maria that had earlier ferried the sick patient ashore raced to get as many passengers off the liner as quickly as possible. By 5:19 a.m., all 2,557 passengers had been safely evacuated from the ship. Soon after, the crew followed. The entire evacuation was carried out in just over 2.5 hours. The Monarch of the Sea's damage was extensive. The ship was dry docked for repairs for 3 months at Atlantic Marine's facilities in Mobile, Alabama. 114 of the ship's compartments had to be cleaned. Most of the machinery had to be replaced. 460 tons of shell plating needed to be installed, and 18 miles of electrical wiring had to be replaced. The U.S. Coast Guard and Norwegian Maritime Directorate issued new recommendations for cruise ship navigation practices, emphasizing the importance of using multiple navigation aids and properly updating charts. The joint investigation by the Norwegian Maritime Investigator and the United States Coast Guard concluded that the grounding of the Monarch of the Seas was due to a myriad of human performance deficiencies. First, the crew's failure to update the ship's charts to include a change in the location of the buoy marking the proselyte reef, and the subsequent reliance on this buoy as the sole means of fixing the ship's position. They should have known. They, like all ships in the area, had been sent a notice which told them that the buoy had been moved. Second was the lack of experience on the part of Second Officer Fjellinger. Third was the failure by Fjellinger to use multiple navigational aids. Royal Caribbean's own International Safety Management Manual emphasizes how important it is to not rely on just one navigational tool, especially when it's nighttime. One of those tools is your eyes. Fourth was the bridge crew's failure to establish a proper voyage plan for the deviation to St. Martin and for the departure to Martinique around Proselyte Reef. Winging it is not usual protocol. And finally, the strained relations among the bridge crew. If Staff Captain Hans Andreasen hadn't been shouted down whenever he made a suggestion, they might have gone the safer route. Although the Monarch of the Seas incident was terrifying, no serious injuries or loss of life were reported. And while the vacationers had planned on partying their way across the Caribbean, not waking in the dead of night while their giant ship rammed into a sandbank, for once, we at Dark Records can give you a slightly happy ending. Everybody lived. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing. It's helping a lot.